Tonight, we begin not with conquest or ceremony, but with a single voice cutting through the silence of ancient Mesopotamia, a voice that would change everything. We're stepping into the world of Abraham, where leaving everything familiar wasn't just brave, it was revolutionary. Picture this. You're comfortable, settled, surrounded by everything you know, when suddenly you hear, "Go to a land I will show you." No GPS, no guarantee, just pure trust in the unknown. Before we journey together into this story of radical faith, take a moment to like and subscribe if this resonates with you. Now, settle in as we explore how one man's willingness to trust God in uncertainty became the foundation of faith itself. Picture yourself in the ancient city of Ur, where the ziggurats pierce the sky like stone fingers reaching toward heaven. The year is somewhere around 2000 BC, and the world feels both vast and impossibly small at the same time. Trade routes snake across continents, carrying spices and stories, but most people never venture more than a day's walk from where they were born. In this world lives a man named Abram, though we'll come to know him by another name soon enough. He's about 75 years old, which in those days meant he was considered quite elderly, and yet there's something about him that suggests his greatest adventures still lie ahead. Imagine him in the early morning hours, perhaps checking on his flocks, the familiar weight of routine settling around his shoulders like a well-worn cloak. Ur wasn't just any city, it was a marvel of its time, with sophisticated irrigation systems that turned desert into garden, and temples that dominated the skyline. The people there worshipped many gods, each with their own temple, their own priests, their own elaborate rituals. Abram's father, Terah, was likely involved in this religious life, some traditions even suggesting he made idols for a living. So when you think of Abram's world, think of a place where the divine felt scattered across many faces, many voices, many competing claims. And then, one day, everything changed. The scriptures tell us simply that the Lord spoke to Abram. But oh, what weight those simple words carry. Imagine what it must have felt like. This voice, singular and clear, cutting through all the noise of daily life, all the competing claims of various gods and goddesses. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household," the voice said, "and go to the land I will show you." Now we might read those words quickly, but let them settle for a moment. Leave your country, your people, your father's household. In Abram's time, these weren't just addresses you could change. They were your entire identity, your security, your understanding of who you were in the world. To leave meant to step into the unknown in ways we can barely imagine today. But the voice didn't stop with what Abram should leave behind. It painted a picture of something beautiful ahead. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Picture Abram standing there, perhaps leaning on his shepherd's staff, the familiar sounds of Ur continuing around him. Merchants calling their wares, children playing in the dusty streets, the rhythmic sounds of craftsmen at their work. And yet, in his heart, everything had suddenly become quiet, focused, as if the entire world had narrowed down to this one moment, this one impossible, beautiful invitation. The call wasn't just about movement, it was about faith. Faith in a voice he'd never heard before, speaking promises that seemed to stretch far beyond his own lifetime. All peoples on earth blessed through him, this childless man of 75. It must have seemed both wonderful and utterly impossible. And yet there was something in that voice, something that made the impossible feel strangely, quietly possible, something that made the unknown feel less like a threat and more like, well, like coming home to a place you'd never been before. Tonight, As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself there with Abram in that moment when everything changed, when the voice of the Eternal broke through the familiar and invited all of us really, to trust in something greater than we can see. The decision, when it came, must have happened in layers, like watching the sun set slowly over the Mesopotamian plain, each moment bringing deeper shades of commitment until suddenly, quietly, Abram found himself saying yes to the impossible. But saying yes and actually leaving, well, those are two different conversations entirely, aren't they? We can imagine Abram in the days following that divine encounter, moving through his familiar routines with new eyes. The sheep still needed tending, the household still needed managing, but now every task carried the weight of impermanence. This might be the last time he guided his flocks to this particular watering hole, the last time he haggled with that particular merchant in the marketplace. And then there was Sarai, his wife. Picture her face when Abram shared what had happened. This woman who had walked beside him through decades of life, through the heartache of childlessness, through all the small joys and sorrows that make up a marriage. God has called us to leave everything, he might have said, and we can only imagine the conversation that followed. Did she think he'd lost his mind? Did she feel a stirring of recognition in her own heart? The scriptures don't tell us, but they do tell us something more important. She went with him. There's something beautiful about that choice, isn't there? Sarai didn't hear the voice herself, at least not directly, but she looked at this man she'd loved for so many years, saw something in his eyes that she trusted more than her own doubts, and said yes to the unknown. Right alongside him. The preparations must have taken weeks, maybe months. You don't uproot a household like Abram's overnight. He was wealthy, the scriptures tell us, with large flocks and herds, servants, tents, all the accumulated possessions of a successful life. Each item that went into the packing represented a choice, what to take into the unknown, what to leave behind in the familiar. But perhaps the hardest part wasn't deciding what to pack. Perhaps it was the conversations with family and friends who couldn't understand. Imagine trying to explain to your neighbors that you're leaving everything because God told you to go to where exactly? To the land I will show you, Abram might have said, and we can picture the concerned looks, the gentle attempts to talk him out of it, the whispered conversations about poor Abram finally losing his grip on reality. His father, Terah, decided to come along at least part way. Maybe it was concern for his son. Maybe it was his own sense of adventure, or maybe, just maybe, he sensed something true in Abram's calling, even if he couldn't quite name it himself. They set out together, this little caravan of faith, heading northwest toward a land called Canaan. But partway there, in a city called Haran, Terah decided he'd gone far enough. Maybe the journey had worn him down. Or maybe Haran felt like a good compromise between the familiar and the unknown. The scriptures simply tell us that Terah settled there and lived out his days. But oh, what stories those few words must contain. Picture the goodbye between father and son. Terah, perhaps looking older than his years after the long journey, choosing the safety of settlement. Abram, now truly stepping into the role of patriarch, understanding that from here on the choices would be his alone to make. The blessing passed from one generation to the next, not through inheritance or ceremony, but through the simple, profound act of continuing the journey when others chose to stop. And so, at 75 years old, with his wife beside him and his nephew Lot traveling with them, Abram took the final step into faith. They left Haran behind and headed toward a promise they couldn't see, trusting in a voice they'd learned to recognize, carrying with them nothing but their possessions and the growing certainty that sometimes the most sensible thing you can do is follow the call toward home, even when you don't know where home might be. The landscape changes as you travel southwest from Haran toward Canaan, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, and then all at once. The fertile river valleys give way to rolling hills, and the air itself seems to carry a different quality, drier, touched with the scent of wild herbs and ancient stones. For Abram and his caravan, each step was a step further from everything they'd known, and deeper into the territory of trust. Imagine the rhythm of those days, the early morning bustle of breaking camp, the gentle lowing of cattle and bleating of sheep as the flocks were gathered, the creaking of wagon wheels and the soft conversations of servants going about their familiar tasks in unfamiliar places. Sarai might have walked alongside the women of the household, sharing the small observations that make any journey bearable. Look how the light falls differently here. Notice how the birds sound almost the same, but not quite. The thing about traveling in ancient times was that you couldn't simply consult a map or follow clearly marked roads. You followed ancient paths, worn smooth by countless generations of traders and nomads. Paths that curved around obstacles and meandered toward water sources. Paths that seemed to have their own wisdom about how to move gently across the land. Abram's journey wasn't a straight line toward destiny. It was a wandering, a gradual unfolding, the way most real journeys of faith tend to be. And then, somewhere in the hill country near a place called Shechem, something remarkable happened. The scriptures tell us that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Picture that moment, after all the weeks of travel, all the uncertainty, all the putting one foot in front of the other without knowing exactly where the path was leading. Suddenly, the destination wasn't just a promise anymore. It was a presence. This land, God said, not some distant theoretical inheritance, but this specific place where Abram's feet were planted, where his eyes could see the sweep of hills and valleys, where his hands could touch the bark of the great terebinth trees that dotted the landscape. The promise had geography now, weight and texture, and the particular quality of light that comes just before sunset in the Judean hills. Abram's response was as practical as it was profound. He built an altar there, not a grand temple or an elaborate shrine, just a simple stone altar where he could offer sacrifice and mark the place where heaven had touched earth in his life. There's something beautiful about that impulse, isn't it? When we encounter the sacred, we want to remember. We want to create some small monument to the moment when everything became clear, even if only for an instant. From Shechem, the journey continued south, and at each significant stopping place, Abram built another altar. Near Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, he pitched his tent and built another altar and called on the name of the Lord. These weren't grand religious ceremonies. They were more like quiet conversations, moments of gratitude and continued commitment, small acts of worship that dotted the landscape like stepping stones across a stream. You can picture him in the evening perhaps, after the camp had settled and the fires were burning low, standing beside one of these simple altars, looking up at the same stars his descendants would someday navigate by, feeling the weight of promise settling around his shoulders like a prayer shawl. The land stretched out before him in all directions, not his yet, not in any legal sense, but his, in the deeper way that mattered. His because God had said so, his because he had chosen to believe. And Sarai, watching from the entrance of their tent, seeing her husband transformed by trust, no longer the wealthy merchant from Ur, but something new. A man learning to live by promise rather than possession, learning to call a place home not because he owned it, but because he belonged to the one who had called him there. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had shone on Ur, and yet everything was different now. They were no longer refugees from the familiar. They were pioneers of faith, the first to discover that home isn't always the place you start from. Sometimes it's the place you're brave enough to journey toward. Not all of God's promises unfold in seasons of plenty. Sometimes the most profound lessons come wrapped in circumstances that make us question everything we thought we understood about faith. For Abram, that lesson came in the form of famine. A severe famine that settled over the very land God had promised to give him. Picture the irony of it. Here was Abram, having left the security and abundance of Ur, because God had called him to this specific place, and now this place, this promised land, couldn't even provide enough grain to keep his household fed. The rains had failed, the crops had withered, and day by day the situation grew more desperate. The same land that had felt like promise just months before now felt like a test of the most challenging kind. We might imagine Abram standing on a hillside looking out over fields that should have been green with growing things but instead lay brown and empty under an unforgiving sun. What do you do when the very place God has called you to seems to be rejecting your presence, when the promise feels more like a puzzle than a gift? The practical answer in those days was Egypt. When famine struck Canaan, people had been heading south to Egypt for generations. The Nile, with its predictable floods and fertile delta, rarely failed to provide. So Abram made the decision that probably seemed most sensible at the time. He gathered his household and headed toward the land of the pharaohs. But as they approached Egypt, a new worry began to gnaw at him. Sarai was beautiful, extraordinarily so, even in her later years, and Abram knew the reputation of Egyptian rulers when it came to beautiful women. In that culture, in that time, a powerful man who desired another man's wife might simply kill the husband and take what he wanted. The thought of losing Sarai, the woman who had walked beside him through everything, was unbearable. So Abram came up with a plan that seemed clever at the time, but would soon reveal the complicated nature of trying to help God out with our own schemes. "Say you are my sister," he asked Sarai, "so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." Now this wasn't entirely a lie. Sarai was his half-sister as well as his wife, according to ancient genealogies. But it wasn't the whole truth either, and as anyone who has ever tried to navigate a half-truth knows, partial honesty has a way of creating complications you never saw coming. Sure enough, Sarai's beauty caught the attention of Pharaoh's officials, and before long, she was taken into Pharaoh's household. Abram, meanwhile, was treated very well indeed, receiving sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels as gifts from a pharaoh who thought he was honoring Sarai's brother. Abram's plan was working perfectly, except for the small matter of his wife being in the palace of the most powerful man in Egypt. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something beautiful about the nature of divine faithfulness. God didn't abandon Abram to the consequences of his fear-driven scheme. Instead, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh's household with serious diseases, a clear sign that something was wrong with this arrangement. Pharaoh, being a wise ruler, recognized a divine warning when he saw one. The confrontation, when it came, must have been both terrifying and illuminating. "What have you done to me?" Pharaoh demanded of Abram. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife?" Picture Abram in that moment, standing before one of the most powerful rulers on earth, caught in the consequences of his own fear, realizing that his attempt to protect himself had actually put both himself and Sarai in greater danger. And yet God had been working even in the midst of the deception, protecting what needed protecting, preserving the promise even when Abram's faith had faltered. Pharaoh, perhaps surprisingly, showed mercy. He returned Sarai to Abram and sent them away with all the wealth they had accumulated. As they headed back toward Canaan, surely Abram was processing what had just happened, how his fear had led him to compromise his integrity, how God had remained faithful even when he hadn't, how sometimes the detours we take teach us as much about trust as the straight paths do. The famine eventually ended, as famines do, and Abram found himself back in the land of promise, wealthier than before, but also wiser. He had learned something about the difference between God's protection and self-protection. Something about how faith sometimes means staying put, even when circumstances suggest you should run. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that God's promises aren't dependent on our perfect performance of faith. Sometimes they endure precisely because of divine faithfulness that exceeds our own. Abundance, it turns out, can create its own kind of problems. And as Abram and his nephew Lot returned to Canaan from Egypt, their success began to strain the bonds that had held their extended family together through the journey of faith. Both men were now very wealthy. Their flocks had multiplied. Their herds had grown large, and their households bustled with servants and activity. In the ancient world, this kind of prosperity was a clear sign of divine blessing, but it also required more and more land to sustain. Picture the daily reality of managing such abundance. Each morning brought the complex choreography of moving large numbers of animals to pasture and water, of finding enough space for everyone and everything to thrive. The land around Bethel and Ai, where they had settled, was good land, but it wasn't infinite. Day by day, the tension grew more obvious. There simply wasn't enough room for both households to continue living in such close proximity. The first signs of trouble probably seemed small. Maybe a disagreement over who had the right to a particular watering hole or whose flocks should graze in a certain valley. But small tensions have a way of growing when people are living in close quarters, and soon the herdsmen of Abram and Lot were quarreling openly. Picture these men, dusty and tired from long days with the animals, their patience worn thin by the constant competition for resources, harsh words beginning to fly over matters that might have been settled amicably in easier circumstances. For Abram, these quarrels must have been heartbreaking. Lot wasn't just his nephew, he was family, the son of Abram's beloved brother Haran, who had died back in Ur. When Abram had first received the call to leave everything behind, Lot had been part of that everything. But instead of leaving him behind, Abram had brought him along, treating him more like a son than a nephew. They had journeyed together through uncertainty, shared the adventure of faith, weathered the difficulties in Egypt side by side. But now their very success was threatening to tear apart what hardship had held together. And making matters worse, the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time, meaning that any public quarrel between Abram's and Lot's people would be witnessed by neighbors who already viewed these newcomers with some suspicion. The last thing they needed was to give the impression that these followers of the one true God couldn't even get along with each other. Abram's response to this crisis reveals something beautiful about the kind of man he was becoming under God's shaping influence. He could have pulled rank. After all, he was the elder, the one who had received the original call, the head of the extended family. He could have insisted that Lot defer to his wishes about how to divide the resources. Instead, he chose the path of generous wisdom. "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine," Abram said to Lot. "For we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Think about the grace embedded in that offer. Abram was giving his nephew first choice of the territory, trusting that God's promises were big enough to encompass whatever land remained. He was choosing relationship over advantage, peace over possession, faith over the kind of grasping that comes so naturally when resources feel scarce. Lot's choice, when it came, was perhaps understandable, but also revealing. He looked around and saw the Jordan Valley, lush and well-watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. It was the obvious choice from a purely practical standpoint. The best land, the most reliable water sources, the greatest potential for continued prosperity. So Lot chose the Jordan Valley and moved his tents near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram, meanwhile, settled in the hill country of Canaan. Not the most obviously fertile choice, perhaps, but the land God had specifically promised to him. And it was there, after Lot had separated from him, that God spoke to Abram again, with words that must have been both confirmation and comfort. "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." Picture Abram standing on those hills, looking out over a landscape that now felt both emptier and fuller than before. Emptier because Lot was no longer part of his daily life, but fuller because God had once again confirmed that all of this, was part of the promise. His generosity had not diminished his inheritance. It had simply made room for God to be generous in return. That night, as the sun set over the hill country and Abram could perhaps see in the distance the lights of his nephew's camp in the valley below, he might have reflected on how faith sometimes requires us to hold things lightly, how the very blessings God gives us can become tests of whether we trust God or the blessings themselves. And perhaps he understood, in some quiet corner of his heart, that letting go, whether of places or people or plans, isn't always loss. Sometimes it's simply making space for God to do something even more beautiful than what we were clinging to. Sometimes the world's troubles have a way of finding us, even when we've chosen the path of peace. And for Abram, living quietly in the hill country of Canaan, that truth came in the form of breathless messengers, bringing news of war and captivity. It was the kind of news that changes everything in an instant. His nephew Lot, along with all his possessions and family, had been carried off by a coalition of foreign kings who had swept through the Jordan Valley like a storm. Picture Abram receiving this news. Perhaps he was sitting in the shade of the great oaks of Mamre, enjoying the peaceful routine of an evening meal, when the messenger arrived, dust-covered and urgent. "Your kinsman has been taken captive," the man might have said, and immediately Abram's world shifted from the contemplative pace of a shepherd's life to the sharp focus of crisis. The political situation was complex, as such situations always are. 5 kings from the cities of the plain, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, had been vassals to a powerful eastern alliance led by King Chedorlaomer. For 12 years they had paid tribute, but in the 13th year they had rebelled, refusing to send the required wealth and goods. Now, in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer had returned with his allies to put down the rebellion and collect what was owed, with interest. The battle, when it came, was swift and decisive. The kings of the plain were routed, their cities plundered, their people taken captive. Among those captives was Lot, along with his wife and daughters and all his household, swept up in the consequences of choosing to live near Sodom and Gomorrah, caught in the undertow of other people's political choices. For many men in Abram's position, the news might have prompted a moment of grim satisfaction. After all, hadn't he given Lot first choice of the land? Hadn't Lot chosen what seemed like the better portion, the more prosperous valley? There might have been a temptation to think that this was simply the natural consequence of Lot's choices, that perhaps this was divine justice working itself out. But that's not how Abram's heart worked. When he heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, the scriptures tell us simply that he called out the trained men born in his household, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. No hesitation, no calculation of the odds, no lengthy deliberation about whether Lot deserved rescue, just the immediate instinctive response of a man who understood that love doesn't keep score of who chose what. Picture the scene as Abram prepared for what would be his first military campaign. This shepherd patriarch, now around 85 years old, suddenly transformed into a general, organizing a rescue mission. The 318 trained men weren't professional soldiers. They were servants and herdsmen who had learned to fight when necessary to protect the flocks from raiders and wild animals, but they were loyal to Abram, bound to him not just by employment but by something deeper, by respect for a man who had shown them what it meant to live by faith rather than fear. The pursuit took them far from home, all the way to Dan in the far north of what would someday be called Israel. It was a journey of weeks, following the trail of a victorious army laden with plunder and captives. Along the way, Abram gained allies, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, the Amorite brothers who had become his friends and neighbors in the hill country. These men could have stayed safely at home, but they chose to join Abram in his risky mission of rescue. The attack, when it came, was launched under cover of darkness. Abram divided his forces and struck the enemy camp from multiple directions, creating confusion and panic among soldiers who thought themselves safely beyond the reach of any pursuit. It was a brilliant tactical move, the kind of strategy that could only succeed with the element of complete surprise. And it worked. The Great Eastern Alliance, so confident in their victory, was routed by a small band of shepherds and herdsmen led by an 85-year-old man who refused to abandon his family. Kedorlaomer and his allies fled, leaving behind their plunder and their captives. Lot was free, along with his family and possessions, along with the other captives and all the goods that had been taken. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the whole story came afterward. As Abram was returning home with the rescued captives and recovered goods, he was met by two kings. One was the king of Sodom, coming to reclaim his people and possessions. The other was a mysterious figure named Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Melchizedek's blessing was brief but profound. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Here was recognition from an unexpected source that Abram's victory hadn't been the result of superior tactics or numbers, but of divine favor. Abram's response was equally significant. He gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything, acknowledging in that gesture that all victory, all blessing, all success ultimately comes from God. It was a moment of worship in the midst of triumph, a reminder that even in our moments of greatest accomplishment, we remain dependent on divine grace. The king of Sodom, meanwhile, offered to let Abram keep all the goods he had recovered, asking only for the return of the people. But Abram refused. I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. Picture that moment. Abram, having risked everything to rescue his nephew, now refusing any reward for his efforts. His concern wasn't just about avoiding debt to the king of Sodom. It was about maintaining the integrity of his relationship with God. He wanted it to be clear that his prosperity came from the Lord's blessing, not from human favor or the spoils of war. As the caravan headed home through the hill country, with Lot and his family safely restored and the crisis resolved, Abram might have reflected on how this adventure had revealed something new about his calling. He had come to Canaan to be a blessing, and perhaps this rescue mission was part of what that looked like. Not just receiving God's promises, but being willing to act on behalf of others, even when it was costly and dangerous. The stars wheeled overhead as they made camp that night, the same stars that had guided them through the rescue mission, and Abram might have sensed that something had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to be chosen by God. It wasn't just about personal blessing, but about being the kind of person who would risk everything to bring others home. After the adrenaline of rescue and the complexity of victory, life settled back into its quieter rhythms. But sometimes quiet can be more unsettling than crisis. For Abram, returning to the peaceful hills of Mamre after his successful military campaign, the silence brought with it questions that hadn't had space to surface during the urgency of action. He was now well into his 80s, still childless despite the repeated promise that he would become the father of a great nation. Sarai was beyond the normal years of childbearing, and with each passing season, the gap between promise and reality seemed to widen rather than narrow. In the ancient world, a man's legacy lived on through his children, particularly his son. Without an heir, all of Abram's wealth and accumulated wisdom would pass to his chief servant, a man named Eleazar of Damascus. Picture Abram in those quiet evenings after the rescue of Lot. perhaps walking among his flocks as the sun set over the Judean hills. The very success of the rescue mission might have highlighted the absence he felt most keenly. He had risked everything to save his nephew. But where was the son he had been promised? Where was the beginning of that great nation God had spoken of? It was in this context of unspoken longing that God came to Abram in a vision, with words both reassuring and mysterious. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." Do not be afraid, as if God knew that courage in battle and courage in waiting require different kinds of strength. As if the divine heart understood that sometimes our greatest fears surface not in moments of obvious danger, but in the quiet spaces where unfulfilled promises echo most loudly. But Abram's response revealed the honest wrestling of a faithful heart. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." There's something beautiful about the directness of that response, isn't there? No pious platitudes, no pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Just honest conversation with God about the deepest longing of his heart. Abram had learned to trust God's voice, but he hadn't learned to stop being human in God's presence. God's answer came not in words, but an invitation. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Picture that moment. Abram standing perhaps on a hilltop where the view of the night sky opened wide above him, tilting his head back to take in the vast sweep of stars, scattered across the darkness like scattered diamonds on black velvet. In that time, before cities filled the night with artificial light, the stars revealed themselves in all their magnificent abundance. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and countless individual stars twinkled with the kind of clarity that takes your breath away. Standing there, trying to count them, would have been like trying to count grains of sand on a beach. The very attempt would have driven home the impossibility of the task. "So shall your offspring be," God said, and suddenly the promise took on new dimensions. Not just numerous, but countless. Not just a great nation, but something that would stretch beyond human ability to measure or contain. And then comes one of the most significant verses in all of Scripture. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Right there, under the star-filled sky, something profound happened in the relationship between heaven and earth. Abram's faith, not his perfect behavior, not his flawless track record, but his simple trust in God's promise, was counted as righteousness. Picture that moment of believing. Abram, an elderly man with an elderly wife, looking up at stars he could never count, and somehow finding the faith to believe that his descendants would be equally innumerable. It wasn't a blind leap into the impossible. It was a carefully considered trust in the character of the one who had already proven faithful in so many ways. But God wasn't finished that night. The promise expanded beyond descendants to include the land itself. "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." Again, Abram responded with honest humanity. "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" It wasn't doubt, exactly, but the very human desire for some kind of confirmation, some tangible assurance that this incredible promise was really going to come to pass. What followed was a covenant ceremony unlike anything in Abram's experience. God instructed him to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. The larger animals were to be cut in half, their pieces arranged opposite each other with a path between them. It was an ancient ritual, a way of solemnizing the most serious kind of covenant. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell on Abram. Not ordinary sleep, but the kind of divinely induced rest that sometimes comes when God is about to do something that requires no human effort, only divine action. And in that sleep, God revealed something both wonderful and sobering about the future. The descendants would indeed be numerous, but they would first endure a long period of slavery in a foreign land before finally coming to possess the promised inheritance. 400 years of waiting, of suffering, of holding on to promises that must have seemed impossible to fulfill. But then, as darkness fell completely, something extraordinary happened. A smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces of the sacrificed animals. In ancient covenant ceremonies, both parties would typically walk between the pieces, symbolically saying, "May what happened to these animals happen to me, if I break this covenant." But on this night, only God passed between the pieces. Only the divine presence, symbolized by fire, took the covenant walk. It was as if God was saying, "I will keep this promise, and if I fail, may I be cut in pieces like these animals." Of course, God cannot fail and cannot be destroyed, which meant that this covenant was absolutely irrevocably certain. Abram woke from his deep sleep to find the covenant complete, the promise sealed not by his commitment to God, but by God's commitment to him and his descendants. Under that star-filled sky, with the scent of sacrifice still in the air, he had experienced something that would sustain his faith through all the challenges yet to come. The same stars that had seemed like distant, uncountable points of light now felt like witnesses to an unbreakable promise, like a celestial congregation affirming that what seemed impossible to human eyes was simply another day's work for the Creator of heaven and earth. 10 years had passed since God had first promised Abram a son. 10 years of watching the seasons cycle through their familiar patterns. 10 years of seeing other families grow while his own household remained without the laughter of children. Sarai felt each passing year with the particular ache that comes to those who long for something that seems to slip further away with each passing month. In the ancient world, barrenness wasn't just a personal sorrow, it was seen as a sign of divine displeasure, a source of shame that followed a woman through every social interaction. Sarai had walked through decades of whispered conversations, well-meaning but painful suggestions, and the polite inquiries that never quite masked the underlying judgment. Why hadn't God blessed her? What was wrong that prevented her from fulfilling what everyone considered a woman's primary purpose? Picture Sarai in those quiet moments when the camp had settled for the evening, perhaps mending clothes by lamplight, her hands busy with familiar tasks while her mind wandered to the children she might have been tucking into bed. The promise God had given to Abram was wonderful, but it remained stubbornly theoretical. Where was the son who would carry on the family name? Where was the beginning of that great nation? And so, with the practical wisdom that had helped her survive everything from leaving Ur to weathering the crisis in Egypt, Sarai came up with what seemed like a reasonable solution. If God wasn't opening her womb, perhaps there was another way to fulfill the promise. Ancient customs provided a path forward. A childless wife could give her servant to her husband, and any children born from that union would legally belong to the wife. "The Lord has kept me from having children," Sarai said to Abram. "Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." The servant was Hagar, an Egyptian woman who had probably joined their household during their time in Egypt. Young, healthy, capable of bearing the children that Sarai could not. From a practical standpoint, it seemed like perfect wisdom. From the perspective of ancient law, it was completely acceptable. From the angle of helping God fulfill his promises, it appeared to be taking initiative rather than waiting passively. But sometimes our most reasonable plans create the most unreasonable complications. Abram agreed to Sarai's proposal, and Hagar conceived. But pregnancy changed everything in ways that Sarai hadn't anticipated. The scriptures tell us simply that when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Picture the subtle shift in dynamics. The servant who had once deferred to Sarai now carried what Sarai wanted most in the world. The quiet looks, the small acts of defiance, the growing sense that roles had somehow reversed. For Hagar, the pregnancy might have felt like a form of liberation, no longer just a servant but the mother of Abram's child, the woman who was accomplishing what her mistress could not. In her young mind, perhaps she began to imagine a different future for herself, one where her value wasn't determined by her service but by her fertility. The tension between the two women grew until it became unbearable. Sarai, feeling displaced in her own household, went to Abram with her complaint. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram's response revealed both the limitations of his wisdom and the complexities of trying to manage relationships that have been complicated by our own choices. "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." It was the response of a man who recognized that he was in over his head, but it wasn't necessarily the response of a leader taking responsibility for the consequences of his decisions. What happened next was both tragic and all too human. Sarai began to mistreat Hagar so severely that the young woman fled into the wilderness. Picture Hagar, pregnant and alone, making her way through the harsh landscape between Canaan and Egypt, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the growing certainty that she had nowhere to go. It was there, beside a spring in the desert, that Hagar encountered something she hadn't expected. The angel of the Lord, who found her in her distress and spoke to her with both authority and compassion. "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she replied, and in those simple words was all the pain and confusion of a young woman caught in circumstances beyond her control. The angel's response was both difficult and hopeful. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The child she carried would be a son, to be named Ishmael. God hears. Because the Lord had heard her affliction. But the angel also warned her that this son would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. It was a prophecy that spoke to the complications that would follow from this attempt to help God fulfill his promises through human scheming. Hagar's response to this divine encounter was remarkable. "You are the God who sees me," she said, "for I have now seen the one who sees me." She named the well Bir Lahai Roi, well of the living one who sees me. A name that would echo through generations as a reminder that God sees and cares for the oppressed, even when they are caught in the crossfire of other people's schemes. So Hagar returned to Abram's household and gave birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. For 13 years this son would be the focus of all Abram's hopes for the fulfillment of God's promise. 13 years of watching the boy grow, of teaching him the ways of faith, of believing that this was how God had chosen to make good on his word. But sometimes God's timing operates on a scale that stretches beyond our ability to wait patiently. And sometimes our attempts to help him along create complications that only divine grace can ultimately resolve. In the quiet of desert evenings, as Abram watched his son playing near the tents, he might have wondered if this was really how the promise was meant to unfold, or if there were still surprises ahead that would test his faith in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The stars still wheeled overhead in their countless multitudes, still bearing witness to promises that would be fulfilled in ways no human mind could have planned or predicted. 13 years is a long time to live with the assumption that you've figured out God's plan. 13 years of watching Ishmael grow from infant to young man. 13 years of investing in the future through this son who seemed to be the obvious fulfillment of divine promise. For Abram, now 99 years old, those years had brought a certain settled quality to his faith. The promise had been fulfilled, hadn't it? The son had been born, the family line continued. And then God spoke again. Picture the weight of those years. Abram had become truly elderly now, his body bearing the accumulated burden of nearly a century of life. Sarai was 90, long past any conceivable age for childbearing. The promise of numerous descendants seemed to be resting securely in the person of Ishmael, who was growing into a capable young man, skilled in the ways of desert life, knowledgeable about the flocks and herds that represented the family's wealth. When the Lord appeared to Abram this time, the encounter began with both confirmation and expansion of the covenant they had made under the stars all those years before. "I am God Almighty," the Lord said, using a name, El Shaddai, that spoke of unlimited power and provision. "Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." And response was immediate and overwhelming. Abram fell face down before the presence of the Almighty. Sometimes the divine presence breaks through our settled assumptions and reminds us that we are, after all, creatures standing before the Creator of the universe. What came next was both wonderful and bewildering. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." A new name. Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Not just the father of a son, not just the father of a people, but the father of many nations. The promise was expanding beyond anything Abraham had imagined, stretching into a future that seemed to encompass peoples he had never heard of, nations that didn't yet exist. But then came the part that must have stopped Abraham's heart. "As for Sarai your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Sarah, meaning princess. And not just a new name, but a new promise. At 90 years old, she would bear the son through whom the covenant would continue. All these years of assuming that Ishmael was the fulfillment, and now God was saying that the real fulfillment was yet to come. Abraham's response was profoundly human. He fell face down again, but this time the scriptures tell us he laughed. Not the laughter of joy, but the laughter that comes when something is so far beyond the realm of possibility that you can't quite process it. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? It was the laughter of someone who had learned to trust God's promises, but was being asked to stretch that trust beyond anything that seemed biologically reasonable. Abraham had seen God do miraculous things, but this seemed to require a different category of miracle entirely. His next words revealed where his heart had settled over the past 13 years. "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." In other words, God, I think you've already fulfilled this promise. Ishmael is a wonderful son. Can't we just be satisfied with the miracle you've already performed? But God's response was both yes and no. Yes, Ishmael would be blessed, would become the father of a great nation, would have 12 rulers among his descendants. But no, the covenant promise would be established through the son that Sarah would bear. "You will call him Isaac," God said, and the name itself meant, he laughs, a permanent reminder of Abraham's response to this impossible promise. Then came something that would mark Abraham's descendants forever, the sign of the covenant. Every male in Abraham's household was to be circumcised, and every male child born in future generations was to be circumcised on the 8th day. It was a physical mark in the flesh, a permanent reminder of their special relationship with the God who makes promises that seem impossible and then keeps them in ways that exceed human imagination. Picture Abraham processing all of this. The new name that spoke of a destiny he was still growing into, the promise of a son through Sarah that seemed to defy everything he knew about biology, the physical sign that would mark his descendants forever. At 99 years old, he was being asked to believe that his greatest adventures in faith still lay ahead. That very day, Abraham took every male in his household, including himself and Ishmael, and circumcised them as God had commanded. No hesitation, no delay. If God was expanding the promise, Abraham was prepared to walk forward in obedience, even when the path ahead seemed to wind through impossibilities. As evening settled over the camp that night, Abraham, no longer Abram, but bearing a name that spoke of nations yet to be born, might have looked toward the tent where Sarah was going about her familiar evening routines. Tomorrow, he would need to tell her about her new name, about the promise that seemed to make a joke of everything they thought they knew about aging and childbearing. But tonight, under the stars that had witnessed so many of God's promises, Abraham was learning once again that divine timing operates according to a calendar that human hearts can barely comprehend. The God who had called him out of Ur was the same God who was now promising new life from a womb that had been closed for 9 decades. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our story begin when we're certain the book is nearly finished. Sometimes God's greatest miracles come wrapped in circumstances that make us laugh at the sheer impossibility of it all. The heat of the day had settled over the land like a thick blanket, the kind of oppressive warmth that makes wise people seek shade and wait for evening before attempting any serious work. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent near the great oaks of Mamre, perhaps enjoying the relative coolness that came with the shelter of ancient trees, when he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. In a world where hospitality could mean the difference between life and death for travelers, Abraham's response was immediate and generous. These weren't obviously divine visitors. They appeared to be ordinary men, dusty from travel, in need of refreshment and rest. But something about them prompted Abraham to move with unusual urgency, hurrying to meet them and bowing low in greeting. "If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord," he said, "do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way. Now that you have come to your servant." Picture the scene that followed. Abraham, nearly 100 years old, suddenly energized by the joy of hospitality. He hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf, giving it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He brought curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, setting everything before his guests while he stood nearby under the trees, attentive to their needs. The abundance of the meal, bread made from the finest flour, a whole calf, curds and milk, spoke to both Abraham's wealth and his understanding of proper hospitality. In his culture, sharing a meal created a bond between host and guest, a relationship of mutual protection and care. But more than that, there was something about these particular visitors that called forth Abraham's very best. As the men ate, they asked the question that would change everything. "Where is your wife Sarah?" "There, in the tent," Abraham replied, and perhaps he wondered how these strangers knew his wife's name, knew the new name that God had given her just recently. Then one of them spoke words that would echo through history. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Sarah, listening at the entrance to the tent behind him, heard these words and responded with the same kind of laughter that had seized Abraham when God first made this promise. But hers was the laughter of a woman who had lived with disappointment for so long that hope had become a dangerous emotion. She laughed to herself, thinking, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" It was the laughter of someone who had learned to protect her heart by not believing in possibilities that seemed too good to be true. For decades, Sarah had watched other women bear children, had endured the questions and the pitying looks, had constructed a life that made sense without the gift she most desired. And now, at 90, she was being asked to believe that everything was about to change. But the Lord, for by now it was becoming clear that this was no ordinary visitor, heard her silent laughter and asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?' I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, frightened at being caught in her skepticism, denied her laughter. "I did not laugh," she said. "Yes, you did laugh," the Lord replied. But there was no condemnation in the response, only the gentle insistence of one who sees all things clearly, including the human heart's struggle to believe in miracles. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The question hung in the air like an invitation, a challenge to expand their understanding of what was possible. Abraham and Sarah had learned to trust God in many ways over the years, but they were now being asked to trust Him with something that went against every natural law they understood. After the meal, the men got up to leave, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. As they looked down toward Sodom in the valley below, the Lord revealed to Abraham something that would test his heart in a completely different way. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. 2 of the visitors continued towards Sodom, but the Lord remained with Abraham, and what followed was one of the most remarkable conversations in all of Scripture. Abraham, the man who had learned to trust God's promises, now found himself pleading for God's mercy on behalf of the wicked cities in the valley. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham asked. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" It was the beginning of a negotiation that revealed something beautiful about both divine justice and human compassion. Step by step, Abraham bargained the number down. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. At each stage, the Lord agreed that if that many righteous people could be found, the city would be spared. Picture Abraham in this conversation. The man who had been promised that all nations would be blessed through him, now interceding for cities that had become bywords for wickedness. His nephew Lot lived in Sodom with his family, but Abraham's concern seemed to extend beyond personal interest to a deep care for justice, tempered by mercy. "May the Lord not be angry," Abraham said as he pressed the negotiation to its conclusion. "But let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" "For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it," the Lord answered. And then the Lord went on his way, and Abraham returned home. That night, as he lay in his tent beside Sarah, Abraham might have pondered the events of this extraordinary day. The promise of a son had been renewed with startling specificity, this time next year. The question, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" echoed in his mind, and somewhere in the valley below, the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah hung in the balance, dependent on whether 10 righteous people could be found within its walls. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed so many of God's promises to Abraham. And perhaps he understood that faith isn't just about believing God's promises for our own lives. Sometimes it's about standing in the gap for others, pleading for mercy on behalf of those who don't even know they need it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of faith, new opportunities to discover what it really means to walk with the God for whom nothing is too hard. Dawn broke over the Jordan Valley with the kind of crystal clarity that comes before a day of intense heat, but for Lot and his family in Sodom, this particular dawn would be unlike any other in human history. The 2 visitors who had separated from the Lord at Abraham's tent had arrived in the city as evening fell. finding Lot sitting in the gateway, a place where the leading men of the city conducted business and dispensed justice. Picture Lot in those evening hours, having made a life for himself in this prosperous but morally complicated place. He had grown wealthy here, had become a man of some standing in the community, but the scriptures suggest that his righteous soul was tormented day after day by the lawless deeds he witnessed. Living in Sodom had given him material prosperity, but it had cost him something in spiritual peace. When the strangers arrived, Lot's response echoed the hospitality he had learned in Abraham's household. He rose to meet them, bowed down with his face to the ground, and invited them to spend the night in his house. "Turn aside to your servant's house," he urged. "Wash your feet and spend the night, and in the morning you may rise early and go on your way." At first, the visitors declined, saying they would spend the night in the town square, perhaps testing the true character of the city and its people. But Lot pressed them earnestly, understanding better than they seemed to the dangers that night might bring to strangers in Sodom. Finally, they agreed to stay with him. The evening meal was simple but generous, unleavened bread and the basic provisions of hospitality. But before they could retire for the night, trouble came calling in the worst possible way. Men from every part of the city, both young and old, surrounded the house and called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can know them." The demand was both clear and horrifying. These weren't ordinary criminals, but representatives of a city whose moral decay had reached such depths that even the most basic laws of hospitality and human decency had been abandoned. Lot's response revealed both courage and the terrible compromises that years of living in Sodom had forced upon him. He went outside to meet the crowd, shutting the door behind him to protect his guests, and pleaded with his neighbors, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing." But then he made an offer that reveals how the moral atmosphere of Sodom had affected even this righteous man. He offered his own daughters to the crowd instead. The crowd's response was swift and ugly. "Get out of our way. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They surged forward to break down the door, but the visitors reached out and pulled Lot back inside, striking the men outside with blindness so that they couldn't find the door. Picture the chaos of that moment. Grown men stumbling around in sudden darkness, their evil intentions thwarted by supernatural intervention, while inside the house, Lot was finally learning the true identity of his guests and the real purpose of their visit. Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? The visitors asked. Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. The 10 righteous people that Abraham had hoped for, they weren't there. Perhaps there weren't even 5, or 3, or 2. The moral corruption had become so complete that divine judgment could no longer be delayed. Lot rushed out to warn his sons-in-law, the men who were pledged to marry his daughters. Hurry and get out of this place, he urged them, because the Lord is about to destroy the city. But they thought he was joking. Years of living in Sodom had perhaps made Lot seem like an alarmist, someone who took religion too seriously. They couldn't imagine that their prosperous, powerful city was really in danger. As dawn broke, the visitors urged Lot to hurry. Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished. But even then, Lot hesitated. The scriptures tell us simply that he lingered, and we can only imagine the internal struggle, leaving behind everything he had built, all his accumulated wealth, the life he had created in this place. Finally, the visitors took him by the hand, along with his wife and daughters, and led them safely out of the city. The Lord was merciful to them, the scripture says, and in that simple phrase is captured the patience of divine love, waiting until the very last moment for repentance that never came. "Flee for your lives," the visitors commanded as they reached safety outside the city. "Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." But even in this moment of rescue, Lot couldn't quite bring himself to trust completely. "No, my lords, please," he said. "Let me flee to the small town nearby instead of the mountains." The town was called Zoar, meaning small or insignificant, and perhaps that's what made it feel safer to Lot than the unknown challenges of mountain life. The sun had risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar, and then came the judgment that had been hanging over Sodom and Gomorrah like a storm cloud waiting to break. The Lord rained down burning sulfur from heaven, completely destroying the cities and everyone living in them, along with the vegetation of the plain. But Lot's wife, despite the clear warning, looked back. Maybe it was simple human curiosity, or maybe it was grief for the life they were leaving behind, or maybe it was just the natural tendency to want one last glimpse of home. Whatever the reason, she became a pillar of salt, a permanent monument to the danger of looking backward when God has called us to move forward. From his position in the hills near Mamre, Abraham could see the smoke rising from the valley like the smoke from a great furnace. The cities where his nephew had chosen to live, the place that had seemed so prosperous and appealing when Lot first saw it, were now nothing but smoke and ash. The scriptures tell us that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the catastrophe. Even in judgment, mercy found a way. The prayers Abraham had offered, the intercession he had made for the righteous, had borne fruit in the salvation of his nephew's family, even when the cities themselves could not be spared. That night, as Abraham looked toward the valley where the smoke still rose in the starlight, he might have reflected on the difference between the prosperity that comes from being in the right place geographically and the blessing that comes from being in the right place spiritually. Lot had chosen the best land, but Abraham had chosen the God who owns all the land. And perhaps, in the quiet of that evening, Abraham understood more deeply than ever that the promises of God aren't just about personal blessing. They're about becoming the kind of people through whom blessing can flow to others, even when judgment must fall on those who have turned their backs on righteousness. The stars overhead remained constant, witnesses to both justice and mercy, reminding all who looked up that the God who makes promises is also the God who keeps the moral order of the universe intact. Spring came to the hill country of Canaan with the gentle abundance it had brought for countless generations. Wildflowers carpeted the slopes, shepherds led their flocks to fresh pastures, and life renewed itself in all the familiar ways. But for Sarah, this particular spring carried a difference she had never experienced before. The subtle, unmistakable changes that announced the impossible was happening within her own body. Picture her in those early weeks, perhaps waking in the quiet hours before dawn with the kind of awareness that comes when everything you thought you knew about your own life suddenly shifts. At 90 years old, Sarah was experiencing the morning sickness, the fatigue, the gradual transformation that she had observed in younger women but never expected to know herself. The promise that had seemed so impossible when the visitors spoke it at the Oaks of Mamre was taking root in her womb, cell by cell, day by day, with the patient persistence of divine love working through the natural processes of creation. God was keeping his word in the most intimate and physical way possible, transforming Sarah's body into the vessel through which an entire nation would begin. Abraham, watching his wife navigate this unprecedented experience, must have felt wonder and protective concern in equal measure. Here was the woman who had walked beside him through every adventure of faith, now carrying within her the literal fulfillment of promises that had sustained them through decades of waiting. Every day brought new evidence that God's timeline, however mysterious, was absolutely reliable. The pregnancy progressed through the seasons, Sarah with all the dignity of her years and the quiet amazement of someone witnessing daily miracles, grew round with the child of promise. Neighbors and servants watched with a kind of reverent attention reserved for events that clearly bear the fingerprints of the divine. This wasn't just any birth. This was the beginning of everything God had been preparing for since he first called Abraham out of Ur. And then, at the appointed time, exactly when the Lord had said, at this time next year, Sarah gave birth to a son. The child they named Isaac. He laughs, arrived as the fulfillment of laughter that had begun with Abraham's incredulous response to God's promise and continued with Sarah's skeptical chuckle behind the tent flap. But now the laughter was different. Now it was the laughter of joy, of vindication, of a woman who had learned that God's sense of timing is both perfect and utterly beyond human expectation. "God has brought me laughter," Sarah said, "and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Picture that moment when Sarah first held Isaac in her arms. This woman who had been barren for 9 decades, now cradling the child through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. The baby who represented not just personal fulfillment, but cosmic purpose, not just answered prayer, but the beginning of God's plan to redeem the world. Abraham, now 100 years old, performed the covenant sign of circumcision on Isaac when the child was 8 days old, marking this son as belonging to the God who keeps impossible promises. Every aspect of Isaac's early life was touched by this sacred role. He was breastfed by a 90-year-old mother, celebrated by a 100-year-old father, and surrounded by a household that understood they were witnessing the unfolding of divine history. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned, a celebration that acknowledged not just a milestone in the child's development, but a triumph of faith over impossibility. Here was living proof that God's word never fails, even when it requires miracles that defy every natural law. But as Isaac grew, another reality became increasingly apparent. The presence of Ishmael, now about 16 years old, created a complicated family dynamic that would need to be resolved. The scriptures tell us that Sarah saw Ishmael mocking, perhaps making fun of the attention being lavished on this late-born son, perhaps asserting his own claim as Abraham's firstborn. For Sarah, the situation was intolerable. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," she said to Abraham, "for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The woman who had once given Hagar to Abraham as a solution to childlessness now saw her as a threat to Isaac's future. Abraham was deeply distressed by this demand. Ismail was his son too, a boy he had loved and raised for 16 years, the child through whom he had thought God's promises would be fulfilled. The thought of sending him away was heartbreaking. But God spoke to Abraham in his distress. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, with the weight of divine direction settling his heart, Abraham provided food and water for Hagar and Ishmael and sent them away. Picture that painful goodbye, the father embracing the son he was releasing, the promises whispered about God's protection and provision, the tears that must have fallen on both sides. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert of Beersheba until their water was gone, and when she thought the boy was about to die, Hagar placed him under a bush and sat down about a bow shot away. "I cannot watch the boy die," she said, and began to sob. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink, and God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer, and his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Meanwhile, back in the hill country, Isaac continued to grow in the household of Abraham and Sarah, the child of promise, surrounded by love and shaped by the faith of parents who had learned to trust God through decades of waiting. Every day with Isaac was a gift. Every milestone a reminder that the God who calls us into the unknown is also the God who fulfills his promises in ways that exceed our highest hope. As evening settled over the camp and Abraham tucked his young son into bed, perhaps telling him stories of the long journey from Ur, of the promises God had made, of the adventures that had led to this moment, Isaac would drift off to sleep, surrounded by the security of being deeply loved and divinely chosen. The stars overhead shone with the same faithful light they had provided on the night God first promised Abraham descendants, as numerous as they were. And now, in the gentle breathing of the sleeping child, that promise was beginning its long journey toward fulfillment. Some mornings begin like any other, the gradual lightening of the eastern sky, the familiar sounds of the camp stirring to life, the comforting routines that mark the rhythm of settled life. For Abraham, this particular morning seemed no different from countless others, until he heard the voice that had shaped his entire journey of faith calling his name. "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied, with the immediate attentiveness of someone who had learned to recognize that voice across decades of relationship. What came next would become one of the most challenging passages in all of Scripture, words that would echo through generations as the ultimate test of faith. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Picture the weight of those words settling over Abraham's heart. Isaac, the child of promise, the son through whom all the nations of the earth were to be blessed, the living proof that God keeps his word, even when circumstances make his promises seem impossible. And now God was asking Abraham to offer this beloved son as a sacrifice. The command made no sense from any angle Abraham could examine it. How could God fulfill his promises through Isaac if Isaac was no longer alive? How could the boy become the father of countless descendants if his life was cut short? How could the God who had shown such patience in bringing Isaac into the world now be asking for his death? But the voice was unmistakably the same voice that had called Abraham out of Ur, the same voice that had promised him descendants like the stars of heaven, the same voice that had never failed to keep its word. And so, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac, and after cutting enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. The journey to the region of Moriah took 3 days, 3 days of walking alongside the son he had been commanded to sacrifice, 3 days of normal conversation and shared meals and the comfortable companionship of father and son, all while carrying in his heart a burden he could share with no one. What thoughts must have cycled through Abraham's mind during those long hours of travel? What prayers must have risen from his heart as he watched Isaac walking beside him, chatting about the things that interest young boys, unaware of the purpose of their journey? On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. The moment of decision had arrived. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We will come back to you." Even in the face of God's incomprehensible command, Abraham spoke with faith that somehow, in some way he couldn't understand, both he and Isaac would return. Perhaps he had come to believe that the God who had given life to Isaac from a barren womb could give life back to Isaac, even from death. The writer of Hebrews would later say that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and that in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Father?" "Yes, my son." Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The question pierced Abraham's heart like an arrow. His innocent son, trusting completely in his father's wisdom and God's provision, asking the very question that had no good answer. Abraham's response revealed both his faith and his anguish. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And they went on together, father and son, walking toward a mountain that would test everything Abraham believed about the character of God, everything he had learned about trust and obedience through decades of faith. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Then, with hands that must have trembled despite his resolve, he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Picture that moment. Isaac, perhaps beginning to understand what was happening, submitting to his father's actions with the trust of a son who had never known his father to be anything but loving and wise. Abraham reaching for the knife, with a heart that was breaking even as it remained committed to obedience, preparing to sacrifice the very gift that had brought such joy into his life. Just as Abraham raised the knife to slay his son, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied, the words catching in his throat. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram, and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." As Abraham and Isaac made their way back down the mountain together, the weight of what had just happened must have settled over them both. The God who tests our faith is also the God who provides what we need in the moment of our greatest need. The same divine love that had asked for everything was the love that had provided a substitute, ensuring that Isaac would live to fulfill the promises made so many years before. That evening, as they rejoined the servants and began the journey home, Abraham might have reflected on how this experience had revealed something profound about the nature of his relationship with God. It wasn't enough to receive God's blessings. True faith required the willingness to surrender even the blessings back to the one who had given them. And Isaac, walking beside his father with new understanding of what it meant to be the child of promise, might have begun to grasp that his life had been preserved, not just by divine provision, but by divine purpose. That he was alive not just for his own sake, but for the sake of all the families of the earth, who would one day be blessed through his descendants. The stars that night seemed to shine with special brightness, as if heaven itself was celebrating the faith that had passed the ultimate test, the trust that had held firm even when everything seemed to be at stake. Years have a way of accumulating quietly, like sand settling in the bottom of an hourglass, and for Sarah, the years that followed Isaac's birth were filled with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had finally received the desire of her heart. She watched her son grow from infant to child to young man, each stage bringing new joys and the quiet contentment that comes from seeing God's promises fulfilled in ways that exceed even our most hopeful dreams. But earthly life, even life blessed by divine favor, follows the natural rhythms that govern all human existence. And Sarah, who had lived to see the impossible become reality, eventually came to the end of her long and remarkable journey. She died at the age of 127 in Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, having lived long enough to see Isaac grow into a man of faith and character. Picture Abraham in those final days with Sarah, this woman who had been his companion through every adventure, from the call to leave Ur, through the long years of waiting, through the complications with Hagar and the miracle of Isaac's birth. She had laughed at God's promise and then laughed with joy at its fulfillment. She had been princess and partner, mother and matriarch, the woman through whom the covenant had been passed to the next generation. When Sarah died, Abraham wept for her, not just the tears of immediate grief, but the deep sorrow of someone who was losing the person who had shared his most profound experiences of faith. Sarah had been the only other person who truly understood what it had meant to leave everything behind and trust in promises that seemed impossible. She had been witness to his encounters with God, partner in his struggles and triumphs, the one person who could look at Isaac and remember not just the joy of his birth, but the long journey of faith that had preceded it. But even in grief, Abraham's response revealed the practical wisdom he had developed through decades of living as a sojourner in the land of promise. He needed a place to bury Sarah, a piece of ground that would belong to their family permanently, not just during his lifetime but for generations to come. And so he approached the Hittites who lived in the area with a request that was both simple and profound. "I am a foreigner and stranger among you," Abraham said to them. "Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead." The Hittites' response was generous and respectful. "Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." But Abraham had something more permanent in mind. He rose and bowed to the people of the land and said, "If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me, and intercede with Ephron son of Zohar on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people when Abraham made this request, and his initial response seemed generous. "No, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." But Abraham understood the culture well enough to know that such apparent generosity often came with strings attached, with ongoing obligations and complications that could affect his descendants for generations. He wanted a clean transaction, clear ownership, a piece of the promised land that would belong to his family without question. "Listen to me if you will," Abraham insisted. "I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there." Ephron answered, "Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead." 400 shekels of silver was an enormous sum, far more than the cave and field were actually worth. Ephron was taking advantage of Abraham's grief and his urgent need for a burial place. But Abraham agreed to the price without haggling, weighing out the silver in the hearing of the Hittites according to the weight current among the merchants. Picture that transaction. Abraham in his grief, nonetheless conducting business with the careful attention to detail that would ensure his descendants would never face questions about their right to this land. The cave of Machpelah, the field that contained it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, were deeded to Abraham as his property, in the presence of all who had come to the gate of the city. And then, with the legal formalities complete, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre in the land of Canaan. It was the first piece of the promised land that Abraham actually owned, purchased not through conquest or divine gift but through the practical necessity of having a place to lay his beloved wife to rest. As Abraham stood beside Sarah's tomb in the gathering dusk, perhaps he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this place. From the sophistication of Ur to the hills of Canaan, from the barrenness of Sarah's womb to the joy of Isaac's laughter, from the promises that had seemed impossible to the reality of a son who would carry those promises forward into the future. Sarah's laughter had been silenced by death, but the laughter of Isaac continued, and through Isaac, the laughter of countless generations yet to be born. The woman who had once doubted that she could bear a child in her old age had become the mother of nations, the princess whose descendants would include kings and priests and prophets. That night, as Abraham returned to his tent, where Isaac waited with the comfort that only a loving son can provide, the stars overhead seemed to shine with gentle approval. Sarah had finished her part in the great story of faith, and now it was time for the next generation to carry the promises forward. The cave of Machpelah would become the family burial place for generations to come. Abraham himself would one day rest there beside Sarah, as would Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. It would become a permanent reminder that those who live by faith in God's promises eventually find their rest in the very land those promises had described. But for now, it was simply the place where Abraham had laid his beloved Sarah to rest, the woman whose journey from doubt to faith, from barrenness to fruitfulness, from laughter of skepticism to laughter of joy, had helped make possible everything that was yet to come. The years that followed Sarah's death settled over Abraham like the quiet that comes after a great storm has passed. Not empty silence, but the deep peace of someone who has weathered every test life could offer and found his faith still intact. At 137 years old, Abraham had become truly ancient, a living bridge between the promises God had made and the fulfillment that was still unfolding through Isaac and the generations yet to come. But there was one more piece of business that weighed on Abraham's heart. Isaac was now 37 years old, a man of established character and deep faith, but he remained unmarried. In that culture, at that time, marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was the way families continued, the way covenants were passed down, the way God's promises moved from one generation to the next. And Abraham knew that Isaac's wife would need to be someone who shared their faith, someone who could partner with Isaac in carrying forward the great calling that had begun when God first spoke to Abraham in Ur. The problem was geography. They were living among the Canaanites, whose religious practices and moral standards were incompatible with the faith Abraham had taught Isaac. But Abraham's thoughts turned back toward the land of his origins, toward the family of his brother Nahor, who had stayed behind when Abraham first journeyed toward Canaan. Surely among his own relatives there would be a woman suitable to become Isaac's wife and the mother of the next generation of promise. So, Abraham called his chief servant, the man who had been with him through all the adventures of faith, who had managed his household and understood his heart. This was likely Eliezer of Damascus, the same man Abraham had once thought might be his heir before Isaac was born. "Put your hand under my thigh," Abraham said, invoking the most solemn form of oath-taking. "I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant's response revealed both practical wisdom and deep loyalty. "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" Abraham's answer was immediate and firm. "Make sure that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' He will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son." Picture the weight of responsibility settling on the servant's shoulders. He was being sent not just to find a wife for Isaac, but to find the woman who would become part of the covenant lineage, the mother of the generations through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. It was a mission that required not just practical skill, but divine guidance. The servant took 10 of Abraham's camels and departed, carrying with him all kinds of good things from his master as gifts for a potential bride and her family. The journey back toward Mesopotamia was long and arduous, but it was undertaken with the confidence that comes from serving a man of faith and carrying out his commission. As the servant and his caravan approached the city of Nahor in the evening, when the women came out to draw water, he made his camels kneel down near the well outside the city, and there he prayed a prayer that revealed both practical wisdom and deep faith. Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, please let down your jar, that I may have a drink, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and she went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. Drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink. Picture the servant's amazement as he watched this young woman not only respond exactly as he had prayed she would, but do so with such grace and generosity that it was clear she possessed the character needed to be Isaac's wife. She hurried to empty her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels, a task that would have required drawing water for a long time, since 10 camels that had traveled a great distance could drink enormous amounts. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a bakah and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels and gave them to Rebekah. Whose daughter are you? He asked. Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She answered, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. We have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night. Then the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives. The young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. And when Rebekah's brother Laban saw the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard her tell what the man had said to her, he went out to the man at the spring and invited him home. What followed was a feast and negotiation, as the servant told the whole story of Abraham's prosperity and God's blessings, of Isaac's birth and the need for a wife who could join the covenant family. Rebekah's family recognized the hand of God in the circumstances and agreed to the marriage. But when morning came and the servant was ready to leave, taking Rebekah back to Canaan, her family asked for a delay. Let the young woman remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go. And so Abraham's journey continues, not in miles, but in memory. A life shaped by quiet strength, guided not by certainty, but by faith. Each step he took echoes in the hearts of those who seek peace over power and purpose over pride. His story is not just a path through deserts and trials, but a reminder that even in the unknown, there can be peace, and in the waiting, there can be strength. This was the journey of Abraham, quiet, enduring, and full of meaning.